Hey, what's up everybody? It's Jason. I hope you're doing well. Today we're doing a brand new movie review, and this time it's Antonio Campos' new film, The Devil All the Time. So The Devil All the Time was co-written and directed by Antonio Campos, and it stars pretty much everybody. The cast includes Tom Holland, Sebastian Stan, Bill Skarsgard, Jason Clarke, who just by the way is one of my favorite underrated actors of all time, and of course Robert Pattinson, who plays a very shrill, gross preacher. Delusions! And just off the bat, this is not a feel-good date night movie, so please don't use it as such. Just watch the film as intended, which is pretty much in a dark room by yourself with a blanket around you just in case, to cover your eyes during the gross parts. So this one actually follows several different storylines, each of which is basically headlined by one of the actors I mentioned earlier, and then of course by the end of the film, each of these storylines converge. But for a majority of the film, we actually follow the storyline of a young boy named Arlo, who's played by Tom Holland, and basically when we get to that point, the story becomes more about how this young man would stop at nothing to protect his family from the evils around him in the small town that they live in. And from that, I'm sure you can guess that almost every other storyline that we follow in this film is that of an evil or very corrupt person in this small town. But one of the really interesting things about this film is that evil in this context is actually a very relative term. I mean, one of the main conflicts at the center of this film is that does the use of one evil to end another justify its means? It's very Machiavellian, I guess. And that's not a question that's answered for you either in the script. I mean, without giving too much away, no character in this entire film is completely good. So as you watch these characters either commit acts of evil or just react to acts of evil that are happening around them, you're kind of forced to confront your own definitions of what is good, bad, evil, moral, and not just as a blanket statement either, but more situation by situation, the way these characters are forced to face them. And obviously, given the title of this film, religion is another big part of it. Malice is a big theme in this film, and basically throughout its entire runtime, we're exposed again and again, and my god, again, to all the evils that men are capable of. But the kick is that all these men portray themselves as good, upright, God-fearing Christian men. And time again throughout the film, you see that either their interpretation of what they believe to be God's word or their interpretation of how they best connect with God is so twisted, and it just turns into what becomes expressed as evil and crime and violence towards one another. And, you know, of course, just take that for what you will, but for me, there was just a very clear portrayal in this film, at least, of a dissonance between God's word, you know, kindness, compassion, and men's perversion of that word into their own kind of sick, twisted ideas. And with those two things in mind, I actually really enjoyed this film for the fact that I think it's going to stick with me for a really long time. And one of the reasons that is because it made me think. I've always thought that the best movies, instead of, you know, just pumping you full of messages and themes or whatever their, you know, agenda is, they draw something out of you. You manufacture it yourself. And in this case, for me, it was thought. Of course, I also want to talk about the performances in this film, not just because it's a star-studded cast, but because they're largely responsible for the impression that this film left on me. Tom Holland and Bill Skarsgard were by far the standout performances for me. I mean, I think this is the best thing I've ever seen Tom Holland in. And Bill Skarsgard did such a fantastic job playing Arlo's father in this film. I mean, I think those two characters stuck out to me especially because there was a lot of internal conflict with them, and neither actor oversold the part, so to speak. So you got the chance to kind of just take it in. There wasn't any dialogue to just say, oh, I'm angry. You just had to kind of feel it and go with the moment in the scene. Okay, and I know I said those were my favorite performances, but I really think Pattinson was kind of the cherry on top of this film. I mean, he just plays such a sleazeball preacher in this film, and you hate him so much, but then you love Robert Pattinson for being able to make a character that you hate so much. So in the end, for me, I just ended up appreciating Pattinson more. So with all that in mind, I did think there were a couple of drawbacks to this film. The first one I'll talk about is that this film goes back between two different decades, one in the 1950s and then one in the 1960s. And throughout those time periods, we see the origins of certain storylines and the progression of certain storylines throughout that entire time period. But with the sequences that take place in the 1950s, most of which are just, by the way, in the beginning half of the film, I just really didn't have a lot of vested interest. To me, the film didn't really pick up until the second half. The only thing that I really cared about in that kind of 1950s era sequences were the relationship between Arlo and his father. A lot of that might have to do with just the pacing of the film. I felt like we were either moving too quickly through a certain storyline and we just weren't getting enough details, or we were staying too long but nothing was really happening that gave the film momentum. I can certainly see why they had those sequences. I think a lot of them set up some emotional turmoil and conflict later on in the film in the second half, but ultimately I just enjoyed the second half of the film much more than I did the first. But with that in mind, what the second half of the film lacked for me was character development, especially for a lot of the characters that I would consider evil. We don't really get to see why these people are the way they are, or even how they became the way they are, and that just might have been the commentary. You know, some men just want to watch the world burn, but to me, it left just kind of a gap. It's always hard to kind of swallow a character that's just evil because. So I would have liked a little bit more explanation on that end. Because I think Tom Holland's character is actually set up very well emotionally, and you get to see a lot of his motivations unfold throughout the time span of the 1950s all the way to the 1960s. And with that, I was just left wanting more from the other characters. The last major gripe I had with this film is one that I suspect a lot of people will have with it, which is the narration. My problem with the narration wasn't actually the usual complaints, which is, I guess, weak storytelling and just complete exposition. My major problem is that you'll go a while without it, but then all of a sudden a narration will come in, it'll say something like, and in that moment, such and such thought this, or in that moment, such and such felt this. And it felt like I was reading a book almost, and it was like a third-person omniscient narrator that was just telling us what a character thinks, what a character feels, where in a movie, which is obviously a visual medium, we should be able to tell that from the way the actor is acting or sometimes even the dialogue. So in those instances, the narration actually really took me out of the film. Now, I do feel a little bit bad saying that, because when this film ends and the credits roll, you find out that this film, if you didn't already know, is based off of a book. And the narrator for this movie is actually the author of that book, which I think was actually just a really sweet casting choice, made me all warm and fuzzy inside, especially after the darkness of everything that is this movie. But I feel a little bad about saying that because, you know, it's the author who conceived this book out of nothing, and just his imagination. But I think it still stands that the narration at times really does take you out of the story. Because like I said, it's really set up more like a book at sometimes than it is a movie, which is not what you see movies for at all. But in the end, I actually really did find myself enjoying this movie purely for the fact that it was making me think. And like I said, whenever a movie can bring, or I guess any art form for that matter, can bring something out of you, it makes all the difference in the world. So when everything is said and done, I would consider this a very thoughtful film with a great cast, great story writing, 8 out of 10. Also, if you value your eyes and your psyche, just skip the part of the movie around an hour and 20 minutes in, just skip it. Alright, so that's going to do it for this video. If you guys enjoyed the content, please like or subscribe below. It really helps me out. Until next time, stay safe, be kind. Thank you.